Some sounds don't belong to winter, the old mechanic in town used to say, and if you hear them beneath the ice, you'd better listen. The river should have been silent that morning, sealed under a skin of pale gray ice stretching nearly 40 yards across, its surface dusted with powdery snow that softened every edge of the world, but Daniel Cross heard it anyway. A faint metallic drag beneath the stillness, slow and uneven, like something shifting where nothing should move, and he stopped mid-step, boots crunching lightly on the frozen bank as the cold bit through his coat and settled deep into his bones, the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin but waited patiently to claim the rest of you. And beside him, Rex froze too, ears rising high, amber eyes narrowing toward the center of the river where the ice turned darker, thinner, as if the current below refused to sleep. The dog's breath coming out in quiet bursts of steam while his body leaned forward without command, guided by something older than training, older than memory, and Daniel followed that gaze, his own breath slowing, the world narrowing. Until there was nothing but that stretch of ice and the sound again, faint but unmistakable, a soft clink, then a pause, then another, and for a moment he didn't move, not because he didn't understand what it might be, but because something inside him did, too quickly, too clearly, and memory has a way of arriving without permission, especially in places that feel like silence, a flash of another cold morning years ago, another place where waiting had cost more than he could ever repay, and his hand tightened slightly at his side before he exhaled, long and steady, as if pushing that memory back into the dark where it belonged. But Rex didn't wait. The shepherd stepped forward onto the ice with careful precision, each paw placed with a quiet certainty that ignored the danger beneath, his body low, nose pointed ahead, and then he stopped, stiffening, a low sound building in his chest, not quite a growl, not quite fear, but recognition, and that was when Daniel saw it, not clearly at first, just shadows beneath the thin surface, two shapes moving weakly against the current, half submerged where the ice had cracked and refrozen, their outlines broken by the shifting water, but the movement was there, slow, desperate, and something else, something that made his chest tighten before his mind could explain it. And then the chain caught the light, a dull silver line cutting across the ice, disappearing into the dark water below, and Daniel's jaw set as the wind picked up slightly, brushing across the river with a hollow whisper that sounded almost like a warning. But warnings had never been enough to stop him before, and they wouldn't now, because some things don't wait for permission, some moments arrive already decided, and as Rex turned back toward him, eyes sharp and searching, Daniel nodded once, not to the dog, not even to himself, but to something quieter, something deeper, and then he stepped forward onto the ice, feeling it hold beneath his weight, thin but stubborn, just like the kind of hope he had stopped believing in a long time ago, yet somehow still followed him here, to a place where silence wasn't empty at all, just waiting for someone to hear what it was trying to say, and somewhere beneath that frozen surface, the sound came again, softer now, but closer, as if whatever was down there knew it had finally been found. The ice answered his weight with a low, hollow creak that traveled outward in thin lines beneath his boots, like a warning whispered too late to matter, yet Daniel kept moving, slow and deliberate. Each step measured the way he had learned long ago when the ground itself could not be trusted, his breath steady despite the cold tightening around his chest, while Rex circled ahead with careful urgency, paws spreading his weight across the surface, instincts guiding him along the safest path even where the ice turned darker and uncertain, and the sound beneath them grew clearer now, no longer distant, but close enough to carry a fragile rhythm, a faint scraping followed by a pause, then another, as if something down there still held on to the idea of movement even when strength had nearly left it, and when Daniel reached the edge of the fractured section, he dropped to one knee without hesitation, gloved hand pressing flat against the ice, feeling it tremble ever so slightly beneath his touch, a subtle vibration that did not belong to the river alone, and he exhaled slowly, the air leaving him in a cloud that drifted across the surface before disappearing into the cold, while Rex let out a sharp bark behind him, not loud, not panicked, but precise, the kind of signal that meant there was no more time to think, only to act, and Daniel nodded once, already reaching for the small folding tool clipped to his belt, the metal cold even through his gloves as he struck the ice carefully at first, testing its strength, then harder when it resisted, the sharp cracks breaking the morning silence in uneven bursts, each impact sending thin fractures outward like spider webs beneath the surface, and beneath those cracks the shapes shifted again, clearer now, two forms tangled in the current, their movements weak but determined, driven by something deeper than fear, something that refused to let go. And then he saw it fully, the chains running from their collars to a submerged weight, pulling them just below the surface where the water pressed against them without mercy, and something in his chest tightened, not from the cold but from recognition, because he had seen that kind of struggle before, the kind that did not ask for rescue but simply endured, hoping something would change, and for a brief second his hand paused above the ice, the memory of another moment. Pressing in, another place where seconds had mattered more than anything else, but Rex moved again, stepping closer, placing one paw firmly near the cracked opening, his eyes locked onto Daniel with a clarity that cut through everything else, and that was enough. It always had been, and with a final strike the ice gave way, breaking open with a sharp sound that echoed across the river as cold water surged upward, dark and immediate, the current pushing against the opening as if it had been waiting, and Daniel reached in without hesitation, the freezing water biting through his gloves instantly, sharper than anything he had felt that winter, yet he did not pull back, his fingers finding the chain. First, rough and rigid beneath the surface, and then something else, a collar, and beneath it the faint movement of life that had not yet given in, and he held on, steady, as if the only thing that mattered now was not the cold, not the danger, but the simple act of not letting go, because sometimes that was the difference between losing something forever and giving it one more chance to breathe. The cold did not stay at the surface for long, it moved quickly, slipping through the seams of his gloves and into his skin, a sharp, numbing force that climbed up his arms with quiet persistence, but Daniel held steady, fingers tightening around the chain as the current pulled against him, not violently, but with a constant pressure that reminded him how easily something could be taken if you loosened your grip even for a second, and beneath the water he felt movement again, faint but deliberate, a life that had not yet given up, and slowly, carefully, he shifted his hand lower until his fingers brushed against coarse fur, soaked and heavy, yet still warm enough to carry a fragile trace of heat, and that was all he needed to know. That whatever strength remained down there was still fighting to stay, and he leaned closer, lowering his other arm into the opening despite the cold biting deeper now, his breath catching for just a moment before he forced it steady again, because panic had no place here, not now, not when there was still something to save, and Rex moved closer to the edge, lowering his body until his chest nearly touched the ice, watching every motion with an intensity that bordered on understanding, his ears twitching at sounds Daniel could not hear, his focus locked not on the surface but on something deeper, something that had drawn him here long before Daniel understood why, and then the first shape broke closer to the opening, guided not by strength but by instinct, its movement slow and uneven as the chain allowed only inches at a time, and Daniel adjusted his grip, sliding his hand beneath the collar, careful not to pull too fast, because the ice around the opening was fragile, and one wrong movement could close the gap instead of widening it, and for a moment everything seemed to hold its breath, the river, the wind, even the faint creak of the ice beneath them, until finally the shape rose enough for him to see it clearly, a dog, larger than he expected, its fur darkened by the water, its eyes half closed yet still searching, not with fear, but with something quieter, something that felt almost like recognition, and Daniel felt that look settle into him in a way he could not explain, as if this moment had been waiting long before he arrived, and he tightened his grip, steady and firm, guiding the dog upward inch by inch until its head cleared the surface, water spilling away as it drew a shallow breath that barely made a sound, and Rex let out a low, steady hum beside him, not alarmed, not urgent, but reassuring, as if telling the other that it was safe now, or at least safer than before, and Daniel did not stop, because he could feel the second presence still below, the chain still taut, and without letting go of the first, he shifted again, reaching deeper into the freezing water, his arm trembling now not from fear but from the cold settling deeper into muscle and bone, and yet something held him there, something stronger than discomfort, stronger than memory, something that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the simple truth in front of him, that sometimes the world gives you one moment to decide who you are going to be, and it does not wait for you to be ready, it only waits for you to act. The second chain did not move at first, it held firm beneath the surface as if anchored to something that refused to let go, and Daniel felt the resistance through his numb fingers, a steady pull that made the water swirl darker around his arm, yet he did not rush. Because rushing was how things broke, and he had learned that long ago in places where patience meant survival. So instead he adjusted his position, shifting his weight carefully across the ice, spreading it out the way Rex had done. Lowering himself closer to the opening until his shoulder nearly touched the frozen edge, the cold now seeping through every layer he wore, pressing inward with a quiet persistence that made his muscles tighten, but still he reached deeper, following the line of the chain until his hand brushed against it again, and this time he traced it slowly, inch by inch, until he found where it connected, not to the dog alone, but to something heavier below, something buried beneath the current, and for a moment he paused, his breath steady but slower now, because this was no longer just a rescue, it was a puzzle, and puzzles required clarity even when time felt thin, and Rex shifted beside him. Placing one paw gently against Daniel's arm as if anchoring him there, a silent reassurance that did not need words, and Daniel glanced at him briefly, just enough to see the calm in the dog's eyes, not fear, not urgency, but trust, the kind that does not question what comes next, and that was enough to steady him again, and he reached down once more, this time sliding his hand past the chain until he found the second collar, colder, heavier, the metal worn smooth in places as if it had been there longer than it should have, and beneath it the second dog stirred, weaker than the first, its movement barely more than a tremor against his fingers, yet still present, still holding on in its own quiet way, and Daniel tightened his grip gently, not pulling yet, just letting the contact remain, because sometimes what something needed first was not force but certainty, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tension in the chain shifted, not released, but changed, as if whatever held it below had loosened just enough to allow movement, and Daniel took that moment, drawing the dog upward with careful precision, guiding it through the narrow opening as the ice creaked softly around them, the sound thin and uncertain, like the river itself was watching, waiting to see how this would end, and when the second shape finally rose closer to the surface, its fur breaking through the water in dark, heavy strands, Daniel exhaled a breath he did not realize he had been holding, because even now, even after everything, there was always that small part of him that expected things to slip away at the last second, but this time they did not, and with one final steady pull, he brought the second dog up enough for Rex to step in, gripping gently at the collar and helping guide it onto the ice, working with Daniel in a quiet rhythm that needed no command, and for a moment all three of them stayed there, still and silent, the river moving beneath them, the cold pressing in from every side. Yet something had shifted, something small but undeniable, and as Daniel leaned back slightly, pulling his arm free from the freezing water, he felt it in the quiet space between breaths, that subtle change that comes when something that was almost lost is given one more chance, and he looked down at the chains again, now lying slack against the ice, their purpose no longer holding anything in place, and he knew without fully understanding why, that whatever had brought him here was not finished yet, it had only just begun. For a few seconds, nothing moved except the river beneath them, a slow unseen current carrying the weight of everything that had just happened, and Daniel stayed where he was, kneeling on the ice with both hands resting lightly against the surface as if he needed to feel that it was still holding, still real, while his breath came out in uneven clouds that drifted and disappeared into the pale morning air. And beside him Rex remained close to the two dogs, his posture low but steady, watching them not with caution but with a quiet attentiveness that felt almost protective, as if he understood something deeper than the moment itself, and the first dog shifted slightly, its body trembling not from fear but from the cold settling into its muscles, while the second lay still for a moment longer before drawing a slow, shallow breath that barely disturbed the air around it, and Daniel exhaled softly at that, a small release of tension he had not noticed building, because sometimes survival does not announce itself loudly, it arrives in the smallest signs, a breath, a movement, a refusal to disappear, and he moved carefully now, not rushing, sliding one arm beneath the larger dog's chest and guiding it further onto the ice where it could rest away from the broken edge, the weight heavier than expected but manageable, and the dog did not resist, it simply allowed itself to be moved, its eyes half open, watching him in a way that felt less like fear and more like recognition. And Daniel paused for just a moment under that gaze, something in it stirring a memory he could not fully place, not a face, not a place, just a feeling that he had stood in a moment like this before, where something fragile depended entirely on whether he stayed or walked away, and this time he had stayed, and that mattered more than anything else, and Rex shifted again, nudging the second dog gently with his nose, encouraging it to move, to follow, and slowly it responded, pulling itself just enough for Daniel to reach it more easily, its collar catching the light as it turned, revealing a worn metal tag that glinted faintly against the gray sky, and Daniel noticed it immediately, not because of its shine but because of its shape, slightly thicker than a standard tag. Its edges squared off as if it had been designed for something more than identification, and he reached for it instinctively, fingers brushing across the cold surface, feeling the faint etching beneath the frost, though he did not yet read it, did not yet understand what it meant, only that it did not belong to an ordinary story. And as he helped lift the second dog fully onto the ice, the chains that had held them slipped free and settled beside the opening with a dull metallic sound, no longer pulled tight, no longer serving any purpose, just lying there as quiet evidence of something that should not have been, and Daniel glanced at them briefly before looking back at the dogs, because whatever those chains meant could wait, but this moment could not, and he shifted back slightly, giving them space, watching as both dogs lay close together, their breathing uneven but present, and Rex lowered himself beside them without hesitation, pressing his body near theirs as if sharing what warmth he could, and Daniel sat back on his heels, the cold finally catching up to him in full, seeping through every layer until his hands began to tremble slightly, yet he barely noticed it, because something else had taken its place, a quiet, steady awareness that this was not just an accident, not just a random moment on a frozen river, but something placed in his path with purpose, and as the wind moved lightly across the ice, carrying with it the faint sound of distant trees shifting in the cold, Daniel looked down once more at the metal tag resting against the dog's collar, and though he had not yet read the words etched into it, he could already feel it. The sense that whatever was written there was going to change everything he thought he knew about why he had come here, and why he had not turned away. The wind shifted slightly, not stronger, not louder, but enough to carry a different kind of stillness across the river, the kind that settles in after something has already happened and is waiting for what comes next. And Daniel felt it as he flexed his fingers slowly, trying to bring warmth back into hands that had grown stiff and heavy, the cold now embedded deep beneath the surface, lingering in a way that would not leave quickly, yet he stayed where he was, his attention returning to the metal tag resting against the dog's collar, because something about it refused to be ignored, and he reached for it again, this time more carefully, brushing away the thin layer of frost that had formed across its surface, revealing the faint lines beneath, worn but still visible, and as he tilted it slightly toward the light, the etching caught just enough brightness to become readable, not all at once, but piece by piece, like something that did not want to be understood too quickly, and he narrowed his eyes slightly, focusing past the cold, past the ache in his arms, until the letters settled into place, clean and deliberate despite the years that had passed, and for a moment he said nothing, because recognition does not always come with sound. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet shift in the chest, a subtle tightening that tells you this is not random, this is something you were not meant to overlook, and Rex lifted his head at the same time, ears forward, watching Daniel as if waiting for the same understanding to surface, and when it did, it came without explanation, just a single word etched into the metal alongside a sequence of numbers that carried a weight far beyond their simplicity, something official, something structured, something that belonged to a system Daniel had once been part of, and his thumb traced over it slowly, as if confirming that it was real, that it was not just the cold or the moment playing tricks on him, and the second dog stirred again, its breathing slightly stronger now, its eyes opening just enough to catch the light, and for a brief second it looked directly at him, not with confusion, not with fear, but with a calm that felt almost deliberate, and Daniel felt that look settle deeper than it should have, because animals did not usually carry that kind of presence, that kind of awareness, and yet here it was, quiet and undeniable, and he exhaled slowly, shifting his gaze back to the tag, reading it again in his mind as if repetition might make it easier to accept, but it did not, it only made it clearer, and clarity has a way of changing everything, because once you understand that something is connected, you cannot go back to believing it is not. And he glanced toward the chains lying slack beside the opening, then back at the dogs, and something in the space between those two things began to form, not a full answer, not yet, but the beginning of one. The kind that starts with a question you did not know to ask, and Rex stood then, moving a few steps away from the edge, his nose lowering toward the snow-covered bank as if catching a scent that had nothing to do with the river, his body shifting into that familiar posture of quiet focus, and Daniel watched him, recognizing it immediately, because this was not random movement, this was direction, and slowly he rose to his feet, the stiffness in his legs reminding him how long he had been kneeling there, how far into the cold he had already gone, yet something inside him pushed past that discomfort. Something that had nothing to do with endurance and everything to do with the feeling that this moment was not finished, not even close, and as Rex took another step toward the shoreline, pausing only long enough to glance back, Daniel followed without hesitation, because sometimes the path forward does not come with certainty, it comes with a quiet instinct that says if you walk away now, you will never understand why you were brought here in the first place. Rex did not rush, and that was what made Daniel pay closer attention, because urgency would have meant danger, but this was something else, something quieter and more deliberate, the dog moving along the riverbank with measured steps, his nose low to the snow, tracing a path that curved away from the broken ice and toward a narrow stretch of trees that stood bare against the pale sky, their branches thin and unmoving, as if they had been waiting through the winter for someone to finally notice what lay beneath them, and Daniel followed at a steady pace, his boots pressing into the snow with a muted crunch that seemed too loud in the stillness, yet Rex did not react to the sound, did not lose focus. He simply continued forward as though guided by something beyond scent alone, and behind them the two rescued dogs remained where they had been placed, but not entirely still anymore, their heads lifting slightly, watching, not with confusion, but with a calm awareness that suggested they understood more than their condition should have allowed, and Daniel felt that too, that quiet connection stretching behind him, not pulling him back, but reminding him that whatever he was following now was tied to them as surely as the chains had been moments before. And the air shifted again as he stepped closer to the trees, the cold here sharper, more contained, as if the forest held it differently, trapping the silence in a way the open river had not, and Rex slowed, stopping near a patch of ground where the snow lay uneven, not deep, not smooth, but disturbed in a way that did not match the surrounding surface, and Daniel noticed it immediately, the subtle depression, the faint outline beneath the snow that suggested something solid just below, something that had been there long enough to be forgotten but not long enough to disappear, and Rex pawed lightly at the spot, not digging, not frantic, just enough to draw attention, and Daniel crouched down, brushing the snow aside with careful movements, revealing the edge of something metal beneath, a flat surface. Weathered and dull, its color nearly blending with the earth around it, and for a moment he simply stared at it, not because he did not understand what it was, but because part of him had already begun to understand too much, and he reached out, clearing more snow until the shape became clearer, a rectangular hatch set into the ground, its outline precise despite the years, its edges sealed tight as if it had been meant to stay hidden, and the air around it felt different, not warmer, not colder, but heavier, carrying a stillness that did not belong to the natural world alone, and Daniel placed his hand against the surface, feeling the faint resistance of metal that had not been touched in a very long time, yet it did not feel abandoned, not entirely, it felt, waiting, and Rex stepped back slightly, watching him now instead of the ground, his ears forward, his posture calm, as if this was the moment he had been leading toward all along, and Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath steady despite the quiet tension building beneath it, because he recognized this feeling, not the place, not the object, but the sense of standing at the edge of something that was about to change the direction of everything that came after, and as his fingers traced along the edge of the hatch, searching for a way to open it, he glanced once more toward the river in the distance, where the two dogs lay against the ice, small against the wide stretch of white, yet somehow central to everything that had brought him here, and he understood then, not fully, but enough, that rescuing them had never been the end of the story, it had only been the beginning of something that had been hidden for far longer than he had been searching for anything at all. The edge of the hatch gave way with a slow, reluctant sound, not loud, but deep enough to carry a weight that felt older than the frozen ground above it, and Daniel paused for just a moment as the seal loosened, his hand steady against the metal while a thin line of darkness opened beneath, revealing a narrow gap that seemed to breathe out a different kind of cold, one that did not belong to winter air but to something enclosed for far too long, and Rex stepped closer, not afraid, not hesitant, but attentive, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something beyond the surface, something that did not reach human ears, and Daniel widened the opening carefully, pushing the hatch just enough to allow a clearer view below, where a set of narrow steps descended into shadow, their edges worn but intact, leading downward into a space that had not been touched by daylight in years, and for a moment he did not move, not because he was unsure, but because he understood that stepping forward would change the shape of everything that followed, and that kind of understanding does not rush, it settles, it asks quietly if you are ready to see what you did not come looking for, and Daniel exhaled slowly, the breath steady, controlled, the same way he had learned to move through unknown spaces long ago, and without hesitation he reached into his coat, pulling out the small flashlight he carried more out of habit than expectation, the beam cutting clean through the darkness as he angled it downward, revealing more than just empty space, the light catching on walls reinforced with metal panels, old but not decayed, their surfaces marked with faint lines and numbers that spoke of design rather than neglect. And something shifted inside him then, not fear, not even surprise, but recognition, the kind that does not need explanation because it is already rooted somewhere deeper, and he stepped down carefully, 1 foot at a time, testing each step before placing his weight fully, the cold from above following him partway before fading into a stillness that felt almost insulated, as if the world outside had been left behind the moment he crossed the threshold. And Rex followed without command, moving just behind him with the same quiet certainty he had shown since the river, his presence steady, grounding, and as they reached the bottom, the beam of light widened across the space, revealing a room larger than expected. Not vast, but structured, deliberate, with equipment arranged along the walls in a way that suggested purpose, not storage, and Daniel swept the light slowly from one side to the other, taking in the details. Without speaking, because there was no need for words when the truth was already forming in the silence, and then the light paused, settling on a panel set into the far wall, its surface smoother than the rest, bearing the same marking he had seen etched into the metal tag, the same sequence, the same deliberate design, and something in his chest tightened again, not from confusion, but from the realization that this was not a coincidence, not a forgotten place stumbled upon by chance, but something connected, something that had been waiting beneath the surface for far longer than he had been searching for anything at all, and above them, far beyond the sealed hatch and the frozen river, the 2 dogs remained where they had been left, but even from below, Daniel could feel it, that quiet thread tying everything together, the rescue, the chains, the tag, and now this place, all part of something that was only just beginning to reveal itself, 1 step at a time. The light lingered on the panel longer than Daniel expected, as if something inside him needed time to catch up to what his eyes were already seeing, and for a moment the room felt completely still, not abandoned, not forgotten, but paused, like a place that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to be opened again, and Rex moved slightly beside him, his nails making a soft, deliberate sound against the floor as he stepped closer to the panel, his nose lifting, his ears angled forward. With that same quiet focus that had guided them from the river to this exact spot, and Daniel followed his movement, lowering the beam of the flashlight just enough to reveal more detail, the surface worn but intact, the markings precise, deliberate, not random scratches but something designed to last, and he reached out slowly, his fingers hovering for a brief second before making contact, the metal cool beneath his touch but not as cold as the air above, and as his hand settled against it, something changed, not in the room, not in the sound, but in the feeling, a subtle shift that moved through him like recognition finally finding its place, and without fully understanding why, he pressed forward gently, and the panel responded, not with resistance, but with a soft, controlled release, a quiet mechanical sound that echoed faintly through the enclosed space, and the surface gave way just enough to reveal what lay behind it, not a void, not emptiness, but something far more intentional, a compartment sealed within the wall, its contents preserved in a way that spoke of care rather than concealment, and Daniel lowered the light, steadying his hand as the beam settled inside, revealing a set of documents. Protected within a clear casing, their edges crisp despite the years, alongside a small metal box no larger than a paperback book, its surface marked with the same sequence he had seen before, and he felt it again, that tightening in his chest, not from fear, not from uncertainty, but from the quiet realization that this had never been random, that every step from the river to this place had been part of something that had been waiting long before he arrived, and Rex let out a low, steady breath beside him, not a sound of warning, not a signal of danger, but something calmer, something that felt almost like approval, and Daniel carefully reached inside, lifting the casing just enough to read the first line of the document beneath the clear surface. The words simple, direct, written with a clarity that did not need decoration, and as he read them, the meaning settled into place without resistance, not as a shock, but as something that had been leading toward this moment all along. A program, a purpose, a legacy tied not just to the place, but to the dogs themselves, to their presence, their endurance, their survival, and he exhaled slowly, the weight of it not overwhelming, but grounding, as if something that had once been uncertain now had direction again, and above them, beyond the sealed hatch in the frozen river, the two dogs waited, no longer bound, no longer hidden, their quiet persistence now part of something larger than the moment that had saved them, and Daniel closed his eyes briefly before opening them again, the light steady in his hand, his posture calm, because he understood now that what he had found was not just a secret buried beneath the earth, it was a second chance, not only for the lives he had pulled from the river, but for his own path forward, one that did not need to be forced or chased, only followed with the same quiet certainty that had brought him here, step by step, moment by moment, until the pieces finally came together. And as he looked once more at the small metal box resting in the compartment, he knew that whatever came next would not be about what had been lost, but about what had been returned in a way he never expected. Because sometimes the world does not give answers loudly, it places them in your hands when you are finally ready to hold them, and asks only that you do not let go.